Good evening, everyone. I'm Prajwal, associated with the Stanford Hindu Students Association. The Sunday evening lectures presented by the Vedanta Society has been an integral part of our events since the past couple of decades. We have had discussions on various topics ranging from the teachings of Swami Vivekananda to Vedas, Upanishads, and the most recent Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. This lecture series has been a great platform not only to get an outlook, but also deeper insight into these Indian philosophical works. Post the pandemic, these lectures on the Zoom platform have helped us to expand this to a wider audience. Continuing these lecture series, I take the pleasure of welcoming you all to a new lecture series on the foundational texts of Indian philosophy, covering the philosophy of different schools like Advaita and that of Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Vallabha, Nimbarka, Baladeva, etc. These meetings will be recorded and it will be posted on YouTube. So if you miss any of these lectures or discussions, please feel free to find it on YouTube. Before starting with the lecture, I would like to request Mr. Sanjay Marimadaya to speak a few words about his amazing experience of the association with the Vedanta Society and a few words on this lecture series as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prajwal. Pranam Maharaj. When I think about what it means, these lectures mean to me, the word that comes to my mind is the old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher arrives. And to that extent, first, my pranams to Swamiji for making time to deliver these lectures and also the preparation that goes behind it. He's a well-recognized scholar and we are delighted that he's here. And I find it my personal privilege that I found him as my teacher on the spiritual path. On the second note, I also want to thank and congratulate all of you for making time here. That means you are ready to listen. And I don't think this is ordinary that you are here. And that gives me and several volunteers like Prajwal and Shashi and others to put in effort to arrange these lectures to serve as the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. My association, when I look back, I'm glad that it is better late than never. So it came very late for me, although the aspiration has been there. My association with Ramakrishna Mission started when I was in the 8th grade. I went to a boarding school, a very renowned boarding school run by Sri Ramakrishna Mission in Mysore. It's called Sri Ramakrishna Vidyashala. I spent 5 years from 8th to 12th grade there. Wonderful discipline and exposed me to so many parts of student. But there are 3 things I remember. One was the word I read in a Sanskrit class, which says, Tena vina trunamapi na trishyati. Without him, even a blade of grass will not move. It really constantly kept me in my mind. And the second is the first book we were given when we joined the boarding school, which translates to something like, you are the maker of your own destiny. Both were very contradicting at that time. But it took me several years now to understand the meaning. And the third point that I heard from Sri Ramakrishna is, as many people, so many paths for spirituality or enlightenment. And there is a very good way it is said in Bengali, which I cannot say. But those 3 questions were always there. But along the way with career aspirations, the questions were there. I didn't find the right avenue to get me the answers. I attended so many spiritual lectures. My journey, and I wish to go to Vedanta Society, but was not as active. But there was a lecture in 2015, I believe, which Swami Tattwamayananda gave on Kathopanishad. We had winter lecture series. And the way he described the 3 questions of Nachiketa and the concept of the chariot and the charioteer, I didn't even blink my eyelids for 3 days. And that's where my journey started. I feel it is better late than never. And I'm glad that I think I had to wait for a teacher like Swami Tattwamayananda to come to San Francisco to be on this path. And since then, I've not missed a class. I used to drive every Sunday for an hour to attend the lectures and take notes. And after a couple of years of attending that, I met a couple of other people who are enthusiasts like you. We thought not many people have the time to go to San Francisco. Why don't we host this lecture in South Bay for more aspirants? That's when we started South Bay lecture series for Indian scriptures. There were about more than, I think I would say 150 people who have attended at least one session So we feel so privileged that there are so many people who are able to attend. And during the pandemic, thanks to Prajwal and his team who are so dedicated, we combined these lecture series. So the reason I'm mentioning this is everybody attending this is not a coincidence. I hope that this lecture series will have as much impact as it has had on so many of us. And it's our privilege to be as a servant of Sri Ramakrishna to deliver these lectures. And I will quote one comment that Abhijit, who is probably on this call attending through YouTube, it sent me a note a few months ago. After so many lectures, now it is all sinking into me. I felt so blessed that I was able to serve. So my comment here is that you have attended here because of your Guru's blessing or your own privilege from many lives. So please attend the lectures, make notes, continue to be here, and make your effort to bring in other people. The goal here is not to be evangelized, it's to get the people who are ready to come here. It's more about, Swamiji always tells, it's quality over quantity. So anybody who's ready, spread the word, who is ready will attend. So with that, I welcome you all to these sessions. It's our privilege to be in this surrounding. Most importantly, these lectures, we derive a lot more because of the questions that arise. And Swamiji will tell that in Vedic scriptures, your questions are very important. Don't accept anything blindly. So we'll go through a 1 hour of lecture. Please note your questions and ask them we'll have half an hour of Q&A. Those bring out the best questions and the understanding improves. So please make notes, ask your questions. If you're on Zoom, you can use the raise your hand button. One of us will moderate who will ask the next question. And if you're on YouTube, you can type the question, we will ask it for you. So with that, with my pranams to Sri Ramakrishna and my gratitude to Swami Tattwamayananda, I request him to start this lecture series. And it's a privilege of a lifetime to be on this journey along with all of you. Thank you, Maharaj.
So, thank you, all of you are my friends, and also to Prajwal and Sanjay, who made the introduction. At the very beginning, I shall say a few things. As was said just now, there will be 1 hour lecture, and that will be followed by half an hour interaction. You can ask questions, and for some reason, if there is not enough time for some of the questions that you would like to ask, you can always ask the question in the following session. Okay, now we'll come to the subject right now. So the topic in front of us is the foundational text of Indian philosophy. Now, why do we give so much importance to the foundational text? Now, in Indian tradition, in Indian spiritual and cultural tradition, there is one word, it is called parampara. So parampara, literally it means something that flows continuously, like a river. If you get into the river, you are actually becoming part of a flow. So Indian spiritual tradition, as much as Indian philosophical tradition, both are like a parampara, like a continuous flow. And behind every concept, there's a great mind, a great philosophical mind, not only philosophical mind, but also a spiritual mind. So each philosophical system is actually a huge reservoir of great spiritual and philosophical ideas. To begin with, if you take up any book on Indian philosophy, you will be told, you will find out there are altogether 12 distinct systems of philosophy emerging from India. In fact, there are many more than 12. But generally speaking, you find there are 6 systems of philosophy called Astika Darsanas and 6 systems of philosophy called Nastika Darsanas. Astika and Nastika, these are 2 words. In English translation, sometimes you find heterodox system or non-orthodox system. That's called a Nastika. It is not agnostic, it is not atheistic. That should be very clearly understood. It is not based on a belief of God or its absence that we call a system Nastika or Astika, orthodox or non-orthodox or heterodox. Rather, based on the belief in Vedas, based on the idea of considering Vedic literature, which represent the spiritual revolutions of great sages and saints for the last thousands of years. It's called Vedas. So if you believe in the Vedas as a source, as the most important source of your philosophical tradition, you may be called, or your system of philosophy may be called Astika, orthodox. And its opposite is Nastika. You don't accept the Vedas as the most fundamental or most important, let's say, source of your faith or your speculations. It is not an important document of your testimony. So these are two fundamental classifications you have to remember. Astika, which means orthodox, or a system of philosophy which accepts the Vedas as a fundamental source. Its opposite is Nastika, which refuses to accept, it doesn't accept the Vedas as a fundamental source. This is not as a fundamental testimony or a foundational text. Now, you may ask this question, what's the meaning of Astika and Nastika? So, actually, this word is originally coming from Panini. Panini Ashtadhyayi, 4th chapter, there is a sutra, Asti Nasti Dishtam Matihi. Now, again, I should do justice to the subject that I'm supposed to deal with. When I make a statement, I must give its scriptural link or a textual link from where it is coming. And this is very, very important in modern times, because if you teach a system of philosophy, if you teach a system of spiritual philosophy without giving any connection with the teachers of the ancient masters, then it could be anything. And especially in this age of YouTube and internet, one can go wild and you can have totally crazy and non-authentic ideas floating all over the world, which do not have the scriptural testimony linked to a master. To give an example, suppose you teach mindfulness, let us say, to give a simple example, mindfulness. Mindfulness is a very, very important subject, very popular subject in modern times. Actually, mindfulness is based on one well-known sutta in the Buddhist Pali canonical literature. It is called Mahasatipatthana Sutta or Satipatthana Sutta. It is in Pali, or Maha Smriti Upasthana Sutram or Smriti Upasthana Sutram. This is the Sanskrit verse. The Pali is Mahasatipatthana Sutta or Satipatthana Sutta. The two versions, the bigger and smaller ones. Now the point is, actually, it is an important discourse that Buddha gave to his disciples and to the public on two different occasions. It is from this great original teachings of Buddha that we got mindfulness. It's an important thing to remember. Suppose you forget Buddha and you absolutely refuse to accept any connection with the real great Buddha, and you teach mindfulness, then mindfulness can be like a piece of dry leaf floating in the air. One day it could be forgotten. But if mindfulness as the background of a great man, a great spiritual teacher the world has produced, if you always link it to this great man who was himself an embodiment of mindfulness, or this, this a state of always being in a state of absolute and complete awareness and detachment, is the essence of mindfulness. So I'm giving just one example. So coming to Indian philosophy in general, first of all, I will tell you what are the Astika darshanas, what are the orthodox systems of philosophy. There are 6 in number, that is Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Purvamimamsa, Uttaramimamsa. This is the list of 6 orthodox systems of Indian philosophy, of which Sankhya system of philosophy comes from Kapila Rishi it is called. All these philosophers from whom these systems of philosophy emerged, surprisingly, they were great saints and sages. They not only speculated higher philosophical thoughts, but also they lived in the world of higher philosophy. So if you look at the picture, there are some pictures at least. If you read Gita Press Gorakhpur, the Mahabharata in a 6-volume series or anything, you can find a bird and man with a long hair, Rudraksha, sitting, meditating, like Buddha. So behind each system of philosophy, there is a great meditating mind, a great sage. So Kapila is associated with the original teacher of the system of philosophy known as Sankhya. And Patanjali is the great sage from whom this yoga philosophy emerged. And of course, we had a long, almost 2 years long series of classes on Patanjali Yoga Sutras with different commentaries, which we concluded just about 15 days ago. The third orthodox or Astika system of philosophy is Nyaya. It is coming from the great sage known as Gautama. And the fourth one is Vaisheshika. It is a kind of Indian atomism. It is linked to Nyaya philosophy. Nyaya here means logic, the great school of Indian logic. It is coming from Gautama. And Vaisheshika is also closely linked to this Nyaya system. His author is great teacher is Kanada, it's called. The fifth one is Purva Mimamsa. It is actually a system of philosophy which focuses on dharma. And it believes that you should perform certain Vedic rituals, then you can make sure that you live a happy life in this world. Your pursuit of artha and kama, your pursuit of material needs, material empirical worldly activities and worldly desires, your effort to fulfill your worldly desires should not be in violation of certain fundamental principles called dharma. And this great system of philosophy was taught by Jaimini. And the sixth, in fact, the most important, and in fact, the one system of philosophy which is still very much in practice in different parts of the world, which were actually taught by Shankaracharya and was brought to Western world by Swami Vivekananda in 19th century. That system of philosophy is still flourishing. In fact, the very temple in which I'm sitting here was built by a Swami who was sent here in San Francisco by Swami Vivekananda in the beginning of the 20th century to build this temple. It is called Vedanta. Vedanta means the essence of Vedas, or what we call the last final conclusion of Vedas. So this Vedanta philosophy is coming from a great sage known as Badarayana. So these are the 6 systems of philosophy called Astika Darsanas. During interaction, and of course during the coming series of classes, we may run into several sessions. If you have got any doubt, you can ask, you can go back to the previous videos and you can clarify whatever doubts you can have. I will do my best to clarify those doubts. So these are the Astika Darsanas, or what may be called orthodox systems of Indian philosophy. Remember, linked to all these systems, there are innumerable other systems of philosophy. For example, even in the Vedantic tradition, there are 7 distinct schools of philosophy. So there are 7 distinct schools of Vedanta philosophy. Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Madhva, Nimbarka, Vallabha, and Chaitanya, Beladeva, and there are Jnana Bhikshu, there are innumerable other systems of philosophy apart from Advaita Vedanta. The second category is Nastika Darsanas, the non-orthodox or the heterodox systems of Indian philosophy. Surprisingly, Nastika or heterodox doesn't mean atheistic or agnostic as understood in the Abrahamic tradition, because agnosticism implies indifference, whether indifference with regard to your belief in the existence of God or not. You are ignorant whether God exists or not. So it is still a subject that you can accept or maybe you may be willing to reject. That is agnosticism. Atheism altogether rejects the idea of a God. So the non-orthodox systems of philosophy, at least all of them, cannot be called atheistic in the sense in which the word atheism can be used in modern times, except one system. And that is one of the oldest one. It's called Charvaka. It's the Indian materialism. You'll be surprised to know there is a highly evolved school of Indian materialism in ancient times. And its author also was a rishi, Charvaka Rishi, and his commentator was Vatsyayana. So you find Vatsyayana Sutras. So the point is not fully available right now. So among the 6 systems of Indian philosophy, which are called Nastika, or we may call non-orthodox or heterodox, the first one is Charvaka, which is kind of Indian materialism. The second one is Jaina, and Jaina philosophy is linked to a great sage, is a Tirthankara in Vardhamana Mahavira, who also believed in the lives and teachings of many innumerable lineage of great teachers, even preceding Vardhamana Mahavira, who maybe interestingly, he was an elder contemporary of Buddha, who he must have lived around, let us say, 6th century BC. And then there are 4 systems of Indian philosophy which are linked to Buddhism. They're called, Shunyavada, Vijnanavada, Sautrandika, and Vaibhashi. These are 4 schools of Buddhism which emerged in India long after Buddha's passing away. They began to emerge around 2nd century BC onwards. Buddha actually did not care much for metaphysics or philosophy. His system of philosophy, his teaching was basically based on his desire to see people living a good life in this world. And he was not particularly concerned about life after death. In the Orthodox system, that is Astika system, Asti, Nasti, Daishtika. These are 3 words used by Panini, the great grammarian in the Ashtadhyayi. Asti means those who believe in the continued existence of Atman, those who believe in future life. And they were called Astika philosophers. They were called Orthodox philosophers. As I mentioned, Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaiseshika, Purvamimamsa, Uttaramimamsa. That is Kapila, Patanjali, Gautama, Kanada, which is linked to the Vaiseshika system, and Jaimini and Badarayana. So they all believed in the continued existence of Atman, Jiva, after this life. So they did not believe that human life was primarily meant for enjoyment. They thought this body of ours, all these things are meant for a higher purpose. And the Vedantins believed that that higher purpose was to realize our own spiritual identity, which were interpreted differently by different schools of Vedantins. Altogether 7 schools of Vedanta you can find in Indian tradition, all based on their own interpretations of Brahma Sutras, which many of these ideas will make sense as we enter deeper and deeper into these different subjects in course of time. So Nastika philosophers, the heterodox philosophers, they refused to accept Vedas as a fundamental authority. Astika philosophers accepted Vedas as a fundamental testimony, as a fundamental authority for their philosophical speculations. Nastika philosophers, the heterodox systems of philosophy or the non-orthodox systems of philosophy, they refused to accept Vedas as a fundamental authority. Among them, Indian materialists called Charvakas, Jaina system, and also the four schools of Buddhism, that is Shunyavada, Vijnanavada, Sautrantika, and Vaibhashikas. Now, who are these Buddhist philosophers? In fact, they play a very important role. Today, if you go to China, Japan, Korea, the entire Far East, Indonesia, early, not these days, but in its early days, Siam, Burma, Sri Lanka, you find all these countries. Their history, their culture, their way of life are highly influenced by the teachings of Buddha. And we're talking about the teachings of Buddha, the systems of philosophy that came from this great man, Buddha, who is interestingly considered to be one of the incarnations by Orthodox Hindus. It's an interesting thing. At the same time, Orthodox Buddhists do not accept that Buddha was an incarnation or anything. Orthodox Hinduism accepted Buddha as an incarnation, but Buddhists did not endorse that point of view. So in Buddhist tradition, there were two stages in the philosophical evolution. During the first stage, as I mentioned earlier, Buddha mostly taught in the language of the common people. It's called the vernacular. It's called Prakrit. That's the vernacular. And all his teachings were later on recorded in Pali language. And this happened maybe around 60 or 80 years after Buddha's passing away. Buddha is supposed to have lived most probably from 560 to 480. You have to count backward, BC. 560 to 480, that he lived for 80 years. So he mostly traveled in the northern half of today's India. Let us say all the way from the eastern districts of Bihar right up to today's Afghanistan. And also it seems that he must have even traveled even beyond Afghanistan. We don't know, of course. But anyway, the point is Buddha went about preaching in Prakrit language. And these teachings were later on recorded in Pali language. It's called Pali canonical literature, which mostly contain the fundamental principles of disciplines of these monks, and also great philosophical ideas. For example, the Dhammapada, which closely resembles Bhagavad Gita. It's actually coming from Sutta Pitaka, which is one of the three canonical literary traditions of early Buddhism. It was Sutta Pitaka, Vinaya Pitaka, Abhidhamma Pitaka. Pitaka means a basket. So almost 60 or 80 years after Buddha's passing away, his disciples, under the leadership of Ananda, in the first Buddhist council, which was held in Rajagriha, not far away from today's Part-1, the capital of Bihar state. They had the first Buddhist council, and there all the Buddhist monks, they assembled, they remembered what they learned from Buddha and the other disciples, and they recorded, that's what we believe, that's one tradition, all the teachings in Pali literature. And they belong to three traditions. It's called Pitakas or baskets. Sutta Pitaka, Vinaya Pitaka, Abhidhamma Pitaka. So these Pali working, Pali literary classics do not or did not at that time contain much metaphysical or epistemological ideas. But from 2nd century BC onwards, a large number of highly educated Hindu professors, Hindu philosophers became Buddhist monks. And they started speculating Buddhism using mostly using the the techniques of philosophical speculation that prevail in Vedantic tradition. As a result, four distinct schools of Buddhism emerged. Shunyavada of Nagarjuna, and the most fundamental textbook is called Madhyamika Karika or Mula Madhyama Shastra, which is widely studied in today's Buddhist study, Buddhist viharas, Buddhist temples. It's a very sacred book for those who believe in Shunyavada tradition. It's part of Mahayana system, Mahayana tradition. The second one of the Mahayana system is one of the two main streams of Buddhism, Mahayana and Hinayana. Mahayana system, they give a lot of importance to many of the Sanskrit philosophical classics, like the works of Nagarjuna and Dignaga and others. The Mahayana Buddhism spread in countries like China, Japan, and many of these countries. And the Hinayana system is more orthodox. We gave a lot of importance to Pali canonical literature, which contain many of the original teachings of Buddha. It's more ancient, the more orthodox, more rigid, and more austere in their practices. Hinayana system was popular in countries like Sri Lanka, Burma, and many of these countries. So among the Mahayana Buddhists, there were two schools of Buddhism, philosophical schools of Buddhism that emerged. One is Shunyavada, and his original teacher was Nagarjuna, was perhaps one of the greatest dialecticians of world thought, in the history of world thought. Madhyamika Karika is an absolutely astounding dialectical philosophical work. A lot of polemics, a lot of dialectics you find, with a strong, deep sense of metaphysical inquiry into absolute reality. And he believed the shunya, or nothingness, was the absolute reality. Shunya is wrongly, unfortunately, so to speak, wrongly interpreted or translated in English as nothingness. Actually, shunya implies the indescribability, the non-definability, something that goes beyond words and descriptions and definitions. So Shunyavada is one important school of Mahayana tradition. The second most important philosophical school of Mahayana tradition was Vijnanavada. It's called Yogachara. Actually, it is said that many of them actually practiced Patanjali Yoga Sutra, Ashtanga Yoga. Yama, Niyamasana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, all these they practiced. Dhyana, Samadhi. So they had another name, Yogachara. So its main philosophers were Dignaga, Dharmagirti, Shanti Rekshida, Vasubandhu, and others. These are two fundamental schools of idealism in the Mahayana system, called Shunyavada and Vijnanavada. So Vijnanavada is sometimes called a kind of subjective idealism, but it is certainly much more profound than anything that you find in Berkeley's works, Appearance and Reality. It is far more profound, philosophically, incomparably greater than the subjective idealism, which is actually part of Western philosophical tradition. And the third important school that emerged from 2nd century BC onwards was Sautrantika, which is school of realism. Actually, most of the philosophers of this school, sometimes they belong to the Hinayana tradition. Kumaralada, Ghoshaga, Skantila, some of them were philosophers of this Sautrantika tradition. And they believed in the reality of empirical world. Unlike the views of the Mahayana Buddhists, because both Nagarjuna and also Dignaga, Vasubandhu, and others who belong to Yoga system, they refused to accept the reality of empirical world, worldly objects. Kshanikavada, Kshanabhangavada was common to all Buddhists, but even within the interpretation there were differences. But Sautrantika is Vaibhashikas who belong to Hinayana system. They were realists and not idealists. And Sautrantika and Vaibhashika, Sankhamitra, who actually spread Buddhism in Ceylon, was an important figure in the spread of the Vaibhashika system of philosophy. This is an important point to remember. So now coming to the scriptural tradition. In Indian philosophical tradition, there is something very interesting. That is, the entire theological scriptural tradition can be divided into three categories. I'm talking about the orthodox Astika systems of Indian philosophy, and it's much more important for Vedanta, which what we are going to begin with from next session onwards. So there are three fundamental scriptural traditions or traditions of fundamental textbooks in Indian philosophy. Again, this is with regard to the Astika or orthodox systems of philosophy. It has no connection with the systems of philosophy, the Jaina tradition, Buddhist tradition, or Charvaka tradition. But this is mostly, this is very important to understand the actual position of Vedas and Vedanta. Shruti, Smriti, Puranas. These are three fundamental scriptural traditions or traditions of fundamental text in Indian philosophy. Shruti means Vedas. Shruyate dharma anaya iti Shruti. This is the definition by Mimamsakas. So Mimamsakas believed, or the school of ritualists believed, that Vedas are nothing but a set of scriptures which contain the teachings of dharma revealed to great saints and sages. Nothing much about transcendental higher liberation or anything, but making life happy in this world and also making life happy in the other world. So that's the definition. But the same Sudhi, the word Sudhi was defined by Vedantis. Sruyate amnayate anenaiti means that which teaches Brahmatmanam, Paramatmanam, Labhanti iti Veda. So they interpreted Vedas and Sudhi as a source of the highest knowledge of a transcendental spiritual enlightenment, moksha or liberation. And Sudhi means Vedas. Among the Sudhis, again, you have to remember, there are many sections of Sudhis which do not actually contain highest universal spiritual teachings. There are Samhitas, there are Brahmanas, there are Aranyakas, and also Upanishads. Among them, Upanishads constitute the essence of Sudhi or Vedas. They teach about some higher humanistic, spiritual, universal teachings which are relevant for all of us, for the whole humanity, for all times, which can help us to live a happy life even in this 21st century, even in this age of internet and information technology. We can make use of these higher teachings of Vedanta and make our life more meaningful and make our life more contented and more let's say, full, it's a kind of inner fulfillment. The next category is Smriti. Smriti, remember, you may have come across many of the problems, social problems in Indian society, like casteism, and also a lot of social injustices which prevailed in Indian society in early days. Now it has gone. Great men like Vivekananda, Mahatma Gandhi, Srinarayana Guru, many of them have struggled hard to get rid of all these social injustices. Many of these social injustices were based on teachings of those days, which do not have any value or relevance to our times. So remember, Shruti or Vedas contain the highest universal teachings which are relevant for the whole humanity, which are relevant and of great practical relevance to our own times, which are of great significance, not just to people living in one country or belonging to one religious tradition, but it is significant, it is relevant, it is of great importance for the whole humanity. These Shrutis teach us about the idea that the whole world is one spiritual family. Our ultimate goal is to realize the presence of the divine within us and within everyone, and to look upon the whole humanity as one spiritual family. The fact that all religions eventually lead us to the same goal, to our own spiritual fulfillment. If you live a happy, if you practice certain spiritual and ethical values, then all religions are equally valid. All faith systems can be like so many roads leading to the same goal. And these teachings are based on kind of universal spiritual concept of humanity and existence. But smritis are of secondary importance. Smritis mostly contain do's and don'ts which are of only contemporary relevance for those times. Puranas contain, the third category is Puranas. Shruti, Smriti, Puranas. Shruti can be called Vedas. Smritis are like constitutions, documents explaining the do's and don'ts. And Puranas mostly contain mythological stories, stories which should not be taken literally. All these stories have a deeper message behind the story, behind the story. The authors of Puranas themselves declared, don't take us literally. You can find in the Puranic literature many mythological ideas, but there is a deeper spiritual significance behind many of these stories and parables. So there are 3 verses which are the Pramana slokas with regard to what is the most relevant and significant source book in Indian philosophical tradition. One is from Jabala Smriti. Sudhi Smriti Virodeshu Sridhireva Gariyasi Avirode Sadakaryam Smartam Vaidikavarsada. This is one verse. It is come from Japala, great sage. He says, whenever you find any contradiction or conflict between these teachings of the Vedas, which teach about the higher spiritual universal ideas, and the teachings of the Smritis, which are only of contemporary relevance, or the Puranas, you give importance to Vedas. Next in importance, Smritis, at the last place is for Puranas. And Vyasa, who wrote one of the, he's the author of Brahma Sutras, he's the compiler of all the Puranas. In his own Vyasa Smriti, he says, so this Smriti Virodeshu Sridhireva Giriyasi Avirodetu Sadakaryam Smatam Vaidikavarsana. He says, if there's a contradiction or conflict between what the Vedas teach and the Smritis teach, take the Vedas first. For example, I give you an example. It's the greatness of Hinduism. You can find in many of the Smritis, which are old books. So you can imagine the importance of classifying religious books and philosophical texts into 2 categories of primary importance and then of secondary importance. So whenever there is a contradiction or conflict between the teachings of books which are only of contemporary relevance for those times, and the teachings of the Vedas, which contain the higher universal ideas, you should accept Vedas because they contain universal ideas. And Puranas, which are sometimes very mythological, not always keep in touch with the latest concept of human reason, they should be considered as the last importance. One question you are likely to ask, and you should ask this question, that is, why am I talking about religion when I'm supposed to talk about philosophy? This is a clear answer, because I'm coming to that. One point we have to keep in mind is and this is a very serious problem which is being discussed by innumerable scholars, especially right from 18th century onwards, because the first time the Sanskrit language came known to Western Indologists, mostly those in Germany, Kohlberg, Internitz, and later on, of course, Max Muller, Paul Deussen in 19th century. We find when their works became popular among the intellectual circles of Europe, and in 20th century, even in America, after Vivekananda's visit to America in 1893, people began to ask this question. Why is so much of theology in Indian philosophy? That's a very important question you should remember. Because if we go to Aristotle, if we go to Plato, see, Plato doesn't talk about how you should meditate. Apparently not. The moment you talked about God or higher life, immediately in Western philosophical tradition, they will brand you as a theology, which unfortunately is an inferior place. At least there's an unfortunate way of putting theologians below the philosophers, academic philosophers. In Indian tradition, theology and philosophy always remain intertwined. Now, you can find a number of books written on the teaching of Sunyavada, Nagarjuna, Vijnanavada, which are all very, very famous books, right from the day when China overran Tibet. A large number of great scholars from Tibet in 20th century, and before that, in the early part of 20th century, a number of scholars from Japan came to America and Europe, and many of these books were translated from Tibetan and from Pali into English language. And then only they really understood that Buddhist philosophy cannot be separated from Buddhist religious faith system. Similarly, Shankaracharya's Advaita philosophy, he cannot separate it from certain spiritual practices that go along with that. Yoga philosophy cannot be separated from the actual practice of yamas and niyamas, non-violence, purity, contentment, and so on. So in Indian tradition, philosophy served one purpose as a guideline, as a restraining factor in our pursuit of fulfilling our material desires. They're called four fundamental values of life: dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, called purusharthas. These four values should guide our life. And philosophy has a purpose. And the purpose of philosophy is not only to give us intellectual exercise, but also to actually guide our life, the way we live, the way we eat, the way we interact with others, how we live in this world, how we interact with others in a way that doesn't bring conflict in our mind and that doesn't bring others into conflict with ourselves. So Indian philosophical traditions always had a counterpart, that is a way of actual practice in our life. If we go for a Ramanuja system of philosophy, it's a great system of devotional philosophy. Ramanuja is a great devotee. Sri Vaishnava system is called, qualified non-dualism is called. So Visishtadvaita, it came about 300 years after Shankara's passing. Now, if you look at a follower of Ramanuja's philosophy of non-dualism, you find he will have a mark on his forehead. He will have a way of life. The way he goes to his temple, the way he prays, the way he eats, what he eats. Again, if you go to Sri Shankaracharya system, Shankaracharya not only wrote the most astounding philosophical classics of Hinduism and Vedanta, but also actually composed the most moving devotional poetry in Sanskrit language. 65 of the most devotional, most profound devotional poetry in Sanskrit language were written by Shankaracharya, the greatest of Advaita teachers, the one who actually developed Advaita into a compact philosophical metaphysical system. And he talked about the presence of the divine in our hearts, the presence of the divine that goes beyond temples. But he also installed a number of temples, and also he also wrote beautiful poetry, extolling, praising, glorifying different deities. And also he also set down a system of disciplines, spiritual disciplines, to be followed by his followers in everyday life. So you find a philosophical system is not just an intellectual speculative system. It has something to do with our life, the way we live, the way we interpret our life, the way we look upon people around, the way we act and behave. So also Buddhism. Now, Buddha was not just a metaphysician in the sense of Berkeley or Kant. You see, you are called a Kantian when you teach the critical pure reason in a university or write a book on critical pure reason, you'll be called a Kantian. But to be called a Vedantin, you should do something more than teaching Vedanta text. Your life, the way you think, the way you behave, all should reflect the great Vedantic ideal that you profess. So there is always a link, an unbreakable link between these higher philosophical teachings and our own real life, the way we think, the way we act, the way we live our life, the way we interact with other people. So, and also the way we pray, the way we meditate. So there is always an inseparable connection between philosophy on the one hand and life on the other. And very often, this will take us to our own concepts of God and the ultimate reality. So that's why frequently you find this criticism. Indian philosophy is very all theology and not speculation. That's totally wrong. Actually, if you want to store up all the fundamental textbooks of Buddhism, you need a huge building with so many shelves. If you want to store all the fundamental textbooks of Vedanta, you need a very huge building, a library dedicated exclusively to different schools of Vedanta, either Shankaracharya, or Ramanuja, or Madhva, and so on. So there is an inseparable connection between higher philosophy and also the way we live. And this frequently creates this problem of misconception that there is some of theology in Indian philosophy. So as we proceed further, this becomes very clear to you. Now we can have interaction. This is the first session. I think even the overview is not complete, but I shall explain in the course of time. I shall take a few more sessions explaining some of the fundamental texts and then proceed. Most welcome, all of you. You're most welcome to ask questions. Thank you. Namaskar.
David, please go ahead.
Swami, and maybe you covered this a little bit, and maybe you'll cover it more in your future classes, but is Nagarjuna really the first kind of Advaita Vedantin? I mean, can you say that Nagarjuna, because he come up with non-causality?
Yeah, Nagarjuna was not an Advaiti, he was a Shunyavadi. And the system of philosophy expounded is called Shunyavada. Somebody is called the doctrine of nothingness in English language. And in fact, if you read Nagarjuna's text, it's called the Madhyamika Kari, Mula Madhyama Shastra. On the one hand, and Advaita or other, you find Nagarjuna uses the same term the Shankaracharya used later to explain Brahman. See, for example, non-dual. Nagarjuna's Shunya is non-dual. It is also, it is Paramarthika Sat. For Nagarjuna, Shunya is Paramarthika Sattva. We'll discuss that later, actually. Samvruddhi Satyam, Paramartha Satyam. Samvruddhi Satyam of Nagarjuna is the Vyavakarika, the empirical common sense reality. So he says, when you transcend the empirical, you reach the transcendental. And the transcendental for Nagarjuna is Shunya. And Chandragirti has written a commentary on Nagarjuna's this classical work, this Madhyamika Karika. So Chandragirti insists on saying that even to call Shunya as Shunya is wrong because it is indescribable. And that again is a term that Shankaracharya uses, and also innumerable pre-Shankarite Vedantins used on so many occasions, Anirvachaniya, indescribable, non-definable. Shabda Prabhuti Nirshedha means going beyond all verbalizations. So all these terms are used by Nagarjuna to explain what himself admits cannot be explained. Shunya, which according to him is the transcendental reality, Paramartha Satya. So Samvruddhi Satyam, Nagarjuna uses, and the same term is used by Shankaracharya as Vyavakarika Satya. And Shunya he uses in Vedanta is called Brahman. But very often, what happened? Shunya, he says that when you attain nirvana, you attain the Shunya. But if you attain nirvana, you also attain this great bliss. That is a common teaching in Buddhist tradition. If you are Shunya, then who is going to attain this bliss? According to Hinayana Buddhist, it's like the extinction of a lamp. Nothing is left. But later, Buddhists did not approve of this view. When you attain nirvana, you get out of this praditya samutpada, this 12-link circle of birth, death, and rebirth, or you go beyond this wheel of chakra, the wheel of samsara, transmigratory circle. So there is a belief that there is Nagarjuna system is logically very profound. It's a great dialectical work, but metaphysically it is incomplete, self-contradictory, which Shankaracharya brings out in his own in discussion on Shunyavada in Brahma Sutras elsewhere.
Will you go over that at some point? The distinction, like what chakra?
We are going to discuss. We are going to begin with Shankaracharya's Advaita. At that time, we'll discuss this.
Okay.
Yeah. Just to give a broad view, and then we will take over. Okay. Yeah. Most welcome. Thank you for the question.
Mr. Gopinath, please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Please.
Yeah. Swamiji, I came across a group called Ajivikas. Where do they fall into this categorization that you have provided us?
Yeah. Ajivikas belong to the Jaina tradition. Jaina, they were also Buddhists, they were also Jainas. Ajivikas. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They were Buddhists and also Jaina. See, there was a kind of overlapping because Buddhism was much more widespread, and Jaina system was much more confined to a smaller area. So they all frequently they overlapped. We will discuss when we discuss Jainism and Buddhism. We'll discuss different schools.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shyam, your turn. Please ask your question.
Guruji, Tantra and Kashmiri Saivism, are they come under non-orthodox or?
Yeah, they're orthodox. Certainly, they're orthodox. Yeah, they're orthodox. Kashmir Saivism, Tantra, all these belong to the orthodox Astika tradition. They all accept the Vedas. See, even among the 6 systems of Astika philosophy I mentioned, only Purvamimamsa and Uttaramimamsa are closely linked to Vaidika Parambara, Vaidika Sampradaya, Vedic heritage. Nyaya and Vaisheshika, Sankhya and Yoga are Astikas, orthodox, only in the sense that they do not reject the scriptural authority of the Vedas. But only Purvamimamsa and Uttaramimamsa belong to this tradition. Actually, Kashmir Shaivism, Tantra, they all more or less belong to the umbrella category of Vedanta. Yeah. This is they belong to Astika tradition, Orthodox tradition.
There is a question on YouTube, and after that, there are 2 more questions.
Yeah.
I'll ask the question from YouTube by Rani Ferreira. Swami, is it correct that the followers of all Indian philosophies you are discussing are not vegetarian? What are the sources of those different decisions?
Yeah.
Are those casual decisions or integral to each philosophy, being vegetarian?
Yeah. No, it is wrong to assume that all these philosophers were vegetarians. It's wrong to assume. So if you, the rigid categorization came mostly due to the influence of Jaina religion. See, Buddhism, there are many, many Buddhist traditions which are not vegetarian, no doubt about it. But Jainas were mostly vegetarian. So, and also it is wrong to assume that all these great philosophers were vegetarians. Not at all. In Tantra, never. Mostly vegetarianism was more related to the geographical regions, the availability of food. So can you practice vegetarianism in Tibet? You can't do that. You can think of Tibet in the early centuries of the first millennium. You can't expect, the Vajrayana system developed there. So the rigid categorization into vegetarian, non-vegetarian categories is wrong. Not only that, even the Upanishadic literature, Vedic literature, there are references to non-vegetarian food habits. So that should be kept in mind. Thank you for the question.
AJ, please ask your question. Next, Yogi.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture, Swami. So I heard the mention of nirvana and the bliss. I'm wondering if there is any commentary or thoughts on the physiological basis for this. Is there a biological basis, and is it specific to humans that this is experienced, or might there be other primary species that also experience this? Thank you.
Yeah, nirvana, you cannot. Yeah, no. Nirvana is the result of practicing the 4 noble truths and the 8 disciplines Buddha taught, Sattvari, Arya, Satyani, related to the dukkha, and also the 8 disciplines of practices of righteousness. So we cannot link nirvana to non-human species of creation. No. Yes. In the animal kingdom, you find some certain species showing higher qualities of sensitivity to emotions and feelings. That's true, but they cannot just they cannot guide their own life voluntarily as a conscious act. That's beyond the faculties of the non-human section of the creation. Yeah.
Thank you, Swami. I have a quick follow-up, if I may. So
Yeah.
Even for humans, is there known to be like a physiological basis for this? Essentially, there's some biochemistry underlying this, or is this thought to be something beyond?
Yeah, really, when you practice yamas and niyamas, actually, even the physiology will change. When we practice, for example, contentment, and for example, it's called santosha, which is a very important psychological quality. Yama means ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, parigriha, it's okay. And shauja, tapasu, adhyaya. But contentment, if a person experiences perfect contentment, his emotional system and indirectly his physiological system also will show some impact of this practice of disciplines. There's no doubt about it. But it is the natural byproduct of your spiritual practices. By trying to change your physiological nature, you cannot get samadhi. When you practice yamas and niyamas, then the practice of these great moral and spiritual disciplines will have a positive effect or impact on the way we act, the way we think, the way our body functions. By bringing changes in the bodily functions, you cannot practice, you cannot attain santosha or contentment. It is only one way. As a part of our own spiritual evolution, our body may undergo changes, the way our mind undergoes changes. So emotional systems, the hormones and many things can actually bring in kind of harmony as a result of the spiritual practices. But by trying to physically change, biologically change our body system, we cannot necessarily bring changes in the mind. Except, for example, if you practice some minor asanas, it may help you to sit for a long time for meditation, sthira sukhamasana, the sthairya and saukhya. For a long time, you can sit and in a relaxed mood. But without practicing other disciplines, physical fitness will not help you to practice meditation. That's an important thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yogi, please go ahead.
Pranam Maharaj. In Western philosophy, we hear about epistemology, ontology, theology, psychology, cosmology, soteriology, all these things. How do they fit into Indian philosophy?
It's a very interesting subject, many of us do not perhaps remember that, Indian philosophical system has got the most extensive pramana shastra, epistemology. See, Charvakas believed only in one epistemological tool, that is pratyaksha, direct perception. The Buddhists believed in direct perception and also inference. And again, the Nayayikas and Vaisheshikas, they believed in the three, sometimes four. Sankhya Yoga believed in the four, pratyaksha, anumana, upamana, shabda, means direct perception, inference, the comparison is analogy, and of course, verbal testimony. Among the Indian philosophers, in the Mimamsa system, there are two schools, Prabhagara system and then Bhatta system. Coming from Prabhagara and a little earlier than that, Kumarila Bhatta. Kumarila Bhatta believed in six systems, six epistemological tools. Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana, Shabda, Arthavati, Anupalabdhi. That means direct perception, inference, analogy, verbal testimony, presumption, and also negation, Anupalabdhi. Advaitins also believe in six pramanas. It's called pramana. Epistemological tools means pramanas, theories of knowledge. Prabhagaras believed only in five, leaving out negation, Anupalabdhi. Now, interestingly, there are some fringe groups of Indian philosophers. Certain not so popular, not so extensive fringe groups. Certain schools called, the Pancharatra, certain tantric schools, they believe they extend the inference further, and they say cheshta and aitihya. Sambhava and aitihya. Sambhava means, as a theory of knowledge, if you have seen something, that is actually only direct perception. But some of the Pauranikas, they believed in Sambhava and aitihya. and also hearsay. So, Pratiksha Anumana Upamana Shabda Arthavatya Anubhalabdhi Sambhava Itika 8. Then there are again smaller fringe groups. They believe in two more. That is Cheshta and Parisesha. Cheshta means external gestures. They give funny examples. If a man is sitting in a street corner and is very famished looking, wearing rags, and he is showing up his hand, he's actually asking for food. That is called Cheshta. Actually, all these can be linked to inference, but some of these fringe groups, they want to make it more elastic. And then Parisesha means kind of reductionism, or like Sherlock Holmes used in in the Sherlock Holmes series. You leave out all, you exclude all the improbable, and then you accept, you take up what is left out. It's called the Parisesha or Parisesha. It's called Parisesha Nyaya, it's called in Indian logic or Indian speculation. So Indian epistemological schools are so extensive that some of the crazier group, they extend the inference or anumana into all sorts of wild categories. Sambhava, Aitihya, Cheshta, and Parisesha. So we will come to that when we deal with the Nyaya system of philosophy. The Nyaya system of philosophy has three developments: the Purana Nyaya, Gautama, the Navya Nyaya, and also between that there is Dignaga, Madhyama Nyaya. So Pauranika Nyaya, Gautama, Dignaga, Madhyama Nyaya, and Navya Nyaya. So in the Nyaya system is a very interesting discussion. One may ask this question: why bother our head with all these things? Actually, I tell you, if we can spend our time in the close company of the great philosophers and thinkers of the great human civilizational heritage, is a great joy. We are now sitting, we are now living in a very dangerous age because of the IT and internet, which are being a great blessings. We are also facing the danger of forgetting our own glorious past, the great intellectual, philosophical, cultural heritage, which have made human civilization and given human civilization whatever good things it has got. That should be revived, and in fact, we should try to appreciate this great intellectual heritage of heart and intellect. Okay, so thank you for the question. You can discuss this later when the subject comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you.
There's a question on YouTube, kind of
Yeah.
on the Western philosophy terms by Nanjunda Somiyaji. So the question is on the term speculative philosophy as defined by Western philosophers. He says it is closer to sense experience. And the comment is Indian philosophy goes beyond this definition and eventually to trust Vedas.
Yeah, that's one important special feature of Indian philosophy is the concept of sampradaya. Sampradaya is that, I shall try to explain this now. I gave this example when I was talking about candid philosophy. Say you may call a person utilitarian if you teach James Mill, or that may be Bentham, or if you teach a system of philosophy in a university, you write books on that, you will be called, you'll be given a name connected to that system of philosophy or that philosopher. But in Indian tradition, it is not just teaching or profession of faith in that system. It has something to do with our life. I give this example. A follower of Ramanuja, he should study Gadyatraya, he should study and other thing, and also he should put a mark on his head. At least he's expected to do. Modern time, we don't know. I'm talking about the traditional and he's supposed to do puja and to go to temples and in a particular manner. You talk about Kashmir Shaivism. So you have to practice certain external practices also. You have to be vibhuti and all that, you have to do parayana, all that. Now, a whole huge community of people may not have read the text, fundamental foundational text of the system of philosophy of Kashmir Shaivism or Ramanuja, but still they do that. A person who has not read a single work of Ramanuja, born in a Vaishnava family, may do that. That's the point. He may prefer to give his son the name Srinivasa, which is an important auspicious name in Vaishnava tradition. This happens. So what I mean to say, there is a kind of the sampradaya ideal. I mean, a kind of congregational, practical ideal that brings a system of philosophy to the community level, and not just studying a textbook, but following a particular pattern, a way of life in conformity with the teachings of that great philosopher. That didn't happen in Western philosophy, because not even during Plato's time or Neoplatonism's times, except perhaps I think Socrates was one example who actually linked philosophy. Socrates actually connected what he taught to his own life, and he did practice it. I think with the emergence of the speculative philosophy, there was, I mean, philosophical speculations became a kind of a system of thought, way of the system of writing and speaking and talking, which are really nothing to do with the actual practice in real life. And maybe that's because if you actually bring it to real life, you'll be branded as a theologian. You'll be branded as superstitious. So you see, Augustine's emergence in the 5th century AD actually brought the death of philosophy. After Augustine till Kant, there are many scholars who will tell you there was no philosophy in Europe, because Augustine established the supremacy of theology over philosophy, because certain strong belief systems which are non-negotiable, you cannot ask question. You have to accept the radical sinfulness of man. So the emergence of St. Augustine's rigid theological system practically was a death knell to independent thought in Western world till the emergence of Kant. This is the view. We may discuss this in course of time. That's not our subject. Yeah. But when we talk about Vedanta, I know that many of these ideas will make sense only to specialists, but we'll discuss this in course of time during the time of interaction. Okay.
Next, Sriram, and then there's one final question on YouTube.
Yeah.
Just reflecting on my own family background, we do follow some rituals. For instance, the Shodasha, Samskaras, etc. We also subscribe to Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta philosophy. So is it correct to say that we follow both Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa?
No, actually, if you know, Uttara Mimamsa doesn't contradict or leave out practices, actually.
Rituals are part of it.
Yeah, it's a part of it, you know. Actually, what you're doing is indirectly is nothing with the Panchadevata Puja system or Shanmada system of Shankaracharya. Actually, Shankaracharya established the Shanmada and also Panchadevata Puja to avoid Advaita from becoming a kind of a life-negating idealism, you know. That's an important thing.
We follow Amavasya, Tarpana, do annual Shraddha for Pitru, all those things. Those are all part of.
Right. You know, the point is you can do that, but one should not believe that that's the whole essence of thing. Suppose a person gets obsessed with these rituals, then he is not an Advaita. If he practices, he doesn't violate Advaita, but if he thinks that without that everything is lost, then he violates Advaita. Advaita helps you to look beyond rituals, but not necessarily to reject rituals.
Okay.
Advaita is, Vedanta is all accommodating. It's an important thing. It's all accommodating. It doesn't negate or reject anything, but it accommodates everything. So when a person gets obsessed with rituals, he's actually indirectly he's following Purvamimamsa tradition. But if he practices some of these spiritual disciplines, upasanas, I mean, practices. At the same time, he believes in the presence of the divine as all-pervading reality of Atman, Sarvavyapi, Sarvantaryami, etc. Then he is certainly okay. Do it. That's idea. Advaita never negates anything, never excludes anything. It is an all-accommodative system of philosophy. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Last question. Yeah.
Last question, and I think you would have covered it, by Gopal Srinivasan. Are there any suggested material we can read before the next week's classes that may be helpful?
Yeah. I think you can read, I would say, so we have got enough time, you can read Dr. Radhakshanan's Indian Philosophy, Volume 1, Volume 2. Volume 2 contains Vedantic systems. That may be a good reading. There are smaller books like Satish Chandra Chakravarti, Satish Chandra Chatterjee. Other more extensive works are there. S.N. Dasgupta's History of Indian Philosophy. And also, I would prefer those of you who want to read, have access, you can read Dr. Hriyanna's books, which are very, very authentic, but they deal with certain topics in a specialist, meant for specialists, not as a primer. So Dr. Radhakshanan, Hriyanna, Dr. T.M.B. Mahadevan has written some primary works on Indian philosophy. They are very helpful to beginners. Yeah. So thank you. Before we end today's class, I have an announcement for you. There'll be no class next Sunday, 8th May, because I'll be away. But we'll have the class where we have this class on 15th May. That means next class will be May 15th. There will be no class next Sunday, May 8th. That means our next class will be on 15th May. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Namaskar, Swamiji.